series from Kronos Technology looking at time and synchronization in financial services and trading applications. My name's Chris Farrow. I'll be speaking in this webinar and looking at some of the legal, the regulatory, and security issues of network time. When we think about time, our physical interaction with it on a day-to-day basis is through our normal lives as we go about our daily jobs and tasks. The main thing we notice is probably day and night, going to sleep, going to bed, waking up, starting a new day. But throughout modern life and throughout modern business, and certainly in financial services and trading, time and the generation, distribution, and consumption of time is on a much more accurate, much more granular timescale than that, looking at nanoseconds of accuracy usually. And the type of clocks and the type of systems that produce and distribute and consume these time services are all traceable back to atomic clocks and distributed via satellite distribution systems, usually the GNSS systems, particularly GPS or Galileo in Europe. So this technological set of services that we use and we distribute time via them is known as position, navigation, and time, PNT. And part of our daily lives, modern life, is really based on some of these technological systems and time-based services that keep modern business processes running and ticking. And indeed, the navigation part of it, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the satellite navigation that's either embedded in the car or the smartphone that gets us from A to B. But time is just a portion of that. In terms of financial services and trading, in terms of the legislation and regulation, the technology that's in use in these things is often based on time and has different requirements for different time accuracies depending on those applications. So we have regulations and requirements around data protection and data retention, and then disclosure if any of that data is leaked or if there are any breaches in data security. Typically just time tagging of events, probably no more accurate than maybe a second or fractions of a second, half or a quarter of a second. There is a whole industry building up around technology that regulates these sort of industries, this sort of reg tech that helps both on the compliance side, that enables firms, trading firms, to make sure they are compliant in terms of time services, and in the policing by the regulator, looking at accuracy of trades, accuracy of timestamps, traceability of timestamps. We're also seeing artificial intelligence and big data moving into more mainstream applications, and not only algorithmic trading, but automated and artificial intelligence algorithms to look for patterns and try and detect certain behaviors and indeed predict when things are going to happen within markets. But all this depends really on the quality of the data. It's no use having data that's time-stamped irregularly or time-stamped completely wrongly if these algorithms are combing through the data and looking for certain patterns based on time again. And there is obviously the cybersecurity aspect, keeping not just the data secure, but keeping the sources of time themselves secure and resilient against any interference from any outside actors, whether they're local or international, and whether indeed that's intentional or in some cases unintentional, whether it's just radio interference or other interference with those time services that can degrade performance. So lots of requirements for time. Perhaps the most well-known one, certainly in Europe, is the MiFID II regulations. The European Union MiFID II regulations have just had their 4th birthday. These requirements, these regulations first came into effect on the 3rd of January in 2018. So they've just been around now for just a little bit over 4 years. And they stem from this markets in financial in instruments directive, MiFID II, which tries to regulate and tries to quantify the accuracy of timestamps on reportable events within trading systems and what they need to be depending on the type of trading that's going on. So this regulation has these 3 different levels of granularity and accuracy to UTC. So there's an allowed maximum divergence to UTC. So in this 3rd column here, we have our maximum divergence to UTC for these different types of trading, and there is an equivalent directive in North America that covers trading as well, that says that all their trading clocks should be traceable to NIST, to one of the national physical laboratories within North America, and to within 100 microseconds. And the aim is really to try and prevent irregularities and to provide an audit trail. So if there is any events within markets that need investigation, they can be audited properly. And obviously, with the accurate and verifiable timestamps, then all these events make sense within those audit systems. So it's a bit of a wordy slide, this one, apologies for that, but it takes parts from the regulation and splits them up into these 3 areas. There are 3 distinct areas that they are talking about. They talk about the source of the reference clock. So they say that for MiFID II, all these clocks should be traceable to UTC. They talk about the levels of accuracy that we saw on the previous slide, these 3 different levels, either 1 second, a millisecond, or 100 microseconds. And then they talk about, in the sort of 3rd portion of the regulation, what the regulators expect from traders in terms of compliance. And they expect a lot of documentation of system design, a lot of analysis of timing, generation, and dissemination networks. And then they also expect a once yearly review and with some evidence, so some actual test reports, some actual test data to prove that these systems are capable of meeting those levels of accuracy and granularity requirements. And all sorts of services have sprung up over the subsequent years since 2018, where commercial entities are offering services to get synchronization, to get accurate time synchronization into particularly data centers, usually, where these trading algorithms and trading servers and software packages might be running. So if we start with the first of those 3 things, the source of the reference clock is traceable to UTC, accuracy and traceability to UTC. So what is UTC and where do I get it from? If you want to make sure you're compliant with these regulations, how do you get a UTC clock? What is a UTC clock? What does it look like? How do you connect to it? How do you get UTC time into your trading applications? Well, UTC is an acronym. It's Coordinated Universal Time. It's a compromise acronym. It doesn't make, it's not, the letters aren't in the right order in either French or English. And UTC is a timescale that's coordinated, generated, and ensembled in Paris by the BIPM, the International Bureau of Weights and Measures in Paris, France. And it's based on primary frequency references in all the national physical labs around the world. They all ensemble their frequency standards together using 2-way time transfer satellite modems from their labs into the BIPM lab in Paris in France. And in France, they synthesize this first timescale that's known as TAI, International Atomic Time. And this timescale is different to UTC in that it doesn't have any leap seconds in it. So it's a timescale that's been running for many years now. It's not affected by leap seconds. This concept of leap seconds is something that we use because the Earth's rotation isn't constant. The Earth's rotation is slowing down over time. So if we want solar noon to be correct, if we want to stand on the Greenwich meridian, on the 0 meridian, and at noon we expect the sun to be at its very highest point in the sky, then we have to correct this timescale UTC with leap seconds. We can either add them or take them out. We've only ever added them because the rotation of the Earth is slowing down, but the system does allow leap seconds to be taken out. And so UTC is offset from TAI by a certain number of leap seconds. It's 37 at the moment. And UTC is the performance of all the physical labs that contribute into UTC is published on the BIPM website in a bulletin that's known as the Circular K. It used to be faxed. It used to be sent by fax years and years ago before the internet. So for that reason, for some years, UTC was known as a paper clock. So UTC as a whole, the UTC timescale, doesn't really exist. You can't connect to UTC as a whole. It only exists in the past. So that means it only exists when the BIPM publish their performance details of all the physical labs that contribute into UTC. The physical labs are where you can connect to, where as a user you would be able to connect to. So if we imagine a satellite timing receiver, a GPS or a Galileo timing receiver, that would use, for GPS, it would use this, this component of UTC, and then suffix USNO, that's the US Naval Observatory in Washington. That's the timescale that the North American GPS system uses as its base. So if we connect to a GPS receiver, we would do that. Galileo uses its own timing facility. So a Galileo clock would be traceable to a different component of UTC. But the MiFID regulations allow us to use these UTC-Ks, as they're known. The small k in a suffix is how we refer to the components that go into UTC. So when BIPM published their performance stats, every 5 days you could look at USNO, UTC USNO, and see how it diverged from UTC. But to all intents and purposes, it's a small number of nanoseconds. So in that overall 100 microseconds accuracy requirement for MiFID II, the variations in those various components are of the order of tens of nanoseconds. And MiFID specifically says, it mentions the BIPM and any component of UTC that's measured and traced by BIPM is acceptable to use as a reference and as a test source if we want to measure any of these clocks. So from the requirements of MiFID II, there's a long wordy description there about what we're expected to do to be compliant. So I've highlighted some of the key words in red. And what we're effectively saying is the main things are we want to be traceable to UTC. And also to be compliant, we have to document our system design, the function and the specifications of all our systems that are used for generating, distributing, and actually using and consuming time. So we have to document the whole system and the system design. We have to be aware of, obviously, the tolerances that we're allowed, whether it's 1 second, a millisecond, or 100 microseconds. And we have to provide evidence. This is quite a significant thing. We have to do some measurements and some tests and have some test data. And it's not only a one-shot procedure, it's something that's a continuing requirement that every year, at least once a year, some customers of ours do this twice a year, every 6 months, where they do measurements on site at all their locations where they have these accurate time systems. They make the measurements to make sure they're still within the allowed error. And of course, any servers, any software applications that are using either NTP or PTP clocks, we would have to as well maintain the logs and the error logs and the performance logs from these systems continually so that we can prove how accurate our clocks are and make sure that we're not seeing any errors outside of those specifications. So in terms of documenting things, the first part is often what's known as a paper audit. It's looking at the designs for the network plans, how these time systems and clocks are all connected together, looking at the specification of all the interconnecting nodes, anything that impacts timing, if it's a a network time service like NTP or PTP, then we need to look at the specifications and the performance of any switches and routers that might be in the way. Any service level agreements that are from service providers that are providing us maybe with clock services from those national physical labs, any logs and configs of equipment, and of course look at best practice as well by trying to keep the network routes as short as possible, have fallback and be able to survive single failures and all that sort of common sense that we would put into our network design should go into this audit and all be documented. But we also need the actual measurements as well, the physical measurements. So we need to physically measure the clock outputs from our reference clocks, wherever their source is coming from, any distribution mechanisms we have, whether it's PTP boundary clocks, NTP servers, NTP clients along the way. We physically have to measure wherever we can. It's not always possible because some of these PTP and NTP clocks don't always have physical clock outputs, in which case we would maybe use surrogate devices with physical outputs in the same place in the network. And then the non-physical things are the things I already talked about, like the performance logs and the error logs, the status of any software clock that's running and providing timestamps into trading applications, whether that's at the very lowest level for voice trading or whether it's the highly accurate level required for some of the high frequency trading algorithms. We need to keep all these as part of our test and audit procedure for MiFID II compliance. So just a very generic model here, looking at timing and time distribution in a very generic sense. We have a clock somewhere that generates a source of frequency, time and phase. It might be an atomic clock like cesium, or it might be a satellite receiver. We then have some distribution mechanism that the clock is conditioned and maybe injected into a network, or maybe it's turned into a frequency. It's a 10 megahertz or a 1 pulse per second physical connection. And that can either be directly connected to our application. So our option 1 is a direct connection where we might have a 10 megahertz clock, a 1 pulse per second clock, maybe IRIG time codes, or what are known as SSU clocks, 2.048 megahertz in the telecom world, that's directly connected with a physical cable to whatever application needs it and using it. Or more commonly in financial trading, and particularly software applications that are running in data centers, we have this typically an indirect connection where our time signals are conditioned and turned into network services. They're maybe turned into packets like the network time protocol, carried over the network, and then our application that's using the time is maybe an NTP client that's getting time into a mobile banking application or some sort of software application that needs these accurate and traceable timestamps. So because these are indirect methods, then we have to consider any errors that might be introduced, whether it's delays across the network, any asymmetry, any other things that can degrade this clock as it travels. And in a very generic way, we take our tester as part of the MiFID requirements. We have to provide evidence. So we have dedicated synchronization testers that can measure these physical clocks. They can also look at the packet clocks like NTP and PTP, take packet captures and deduce things from the delays and the timestamps that are in the packets. We have an independent reference, usually another GNSS-based clock, sometimes a small atomic clock. If we can't get GNSS signal, we have portable testers that have those in. And we take our tester and we apply it to the network at these various points and make measurements. So we make measurements at the source of time, at the reference clock. We make measurements within the distribution network, and then we make the same measurements at the point of consumption, whether it's a PTP clock that might be used in a high frequency trading algorithm server, or whether it's an NTP clock or some other clock. We make measurements to make sure then we can document and provide evidence for the regulators who might be interested in MiFID II compliance that we've made these measurements. And this is the thing that has to be the ongoing continual process of performing this at least once every year. So I've talked a lot about MiFID II and about requirements for trading applications. Typically, these are in data centers. Physical security is often extensive. It's often government-issued ID, photo ID you need with some biometric, whether it's fingerprints or iris scans or things like that, biometric data to allow you into the building and then into the equipment floor and then into typically equipment cages. But lots of these clocks that we see are radio-based. They are the satellite clocks that are using the radio signals to get time and frequency from the satellite navigation constellations. And this is effectively an open interface. While the physical controls, the physical security is very extensive, this radio interface is often forgotten about. And this is a photograph of a particular data center in the UK where we have lots and lots of satellite timing receivers all effectively looking to the sky. And jamming and spoofing are real threats. So interference to these satellite clock signals, it's a real thing, something we have to consider, whether it's jamming. These devices on the right-hand side of the screen are a small so-called privacy jammer that you can buy from eBay, very low power, milliwatts, that provide enough interference in the GPS frequency band to stop GPS-based trackers working within a few meters, within 5 or 10 meters. Typically, these are people who are worried about their vehicles being tracked. They buy these things, so they're worried about privacy, personal privacy. Going up to more sophisticated jammers that also interfere with other radio bands that might be providing backhaul to tracking devices like 2G, 3G, 4G and 5G, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and then going up to real serious jammers that will interfere with lots and lots of different communication channels. And these are typically organized criminals that obviously want to block communications from emergency services, any tracking services that high-value vehicles might use. So we see these things with much higher power output. And these are real things. But also spoofing as well. On the left-hand side of the slide, the photograph is of a proof of concept GPS signal spoofer that we built in Kronos a few years ago. And this was using a Raspberry Pi, commercial off-the-shelf software-defined radio that you can buy for a couple of €100, and some open source software, an open source GPS signal simulator that it's easy to spoof GPS signals. So we can spoof the time. Remember that radio interface, the antennas are all completely open. It's becoming easier and easier to be able to spoof time. So we need to consider the security of not just the physical access to the network, but the radio access. And for the financial services industry, this is obviously a very important piece of critical national infrastructure that needs to be protected. And there are systems that can do this. We have systems that can look at the signal from the sky and deduce whether it's a real or a spoofed signal, and then ignore the signal if it looks like a spoofed signal, so that our time systems and time services don't get affected by these spoof signals. How common is it? Type GPS spoofing reports into Google, you'll get numerous hits for not just the unintentional jamming sort of interference, but positional and time spoofing as well. Typically attributed to nation states or military of foreign states trying to protect foreign nationals when they're abroad. But there is extensive reports, so it's not just a proof of concept. It's something that is actually really happening. In terms of security, one of the most popular attacks, one of the most common attacks at the time is against NTP itself. If you put NTP as a keyword into these, the NIST National Vulnerability Database, this one I did a while ago, so I'm sure that number's increased now, but even a while ago there was over 500 matches to NTP. So there are all sorts of well-documented, well-known NTP attacks to either shift the time where you have to be on path, but you can do it also different ways, these different ways using packet fragmentation if you're off path, so you don't have to be necessarily in the network, as long as you can get packets into the network, and also denial of service, distributed denial of service attacks can use NTP servers to cause outages in certain network elements. And if it's a financial services entity that is being attacked, then it obviously has a big impact on people that are trying to use it. So there are ways around this. Just as we have new hardware systems that can detect spoofing, we have the later generation of NTP and even PTP servers that use hardware-based systems. So they're not software. The NTP packets and the processing of the packets doesn't get anywhere near the main CPU of the unit. So this is to avoid those denial of service attacks. Any fragmented packets or any errored packets, any ways that typically NTP has been used to attack NTP servers, these packets are simply dropped by these hardware systems. Because this thing operates in hardware, it can be very, very accurate in terms of its timestamps and very, very good at not being overloaded by attacks from the network. So we have this concept of using these hardware-based NTP systems. The networks themselves are evolving, so the networks that support all these financial applications are evolving to get time into the network. So there's this realization that taking time from maybe just a satellite, just one satellite receiver, if that's interfered with, then your whole time system is gone. So now there's a concept of bringing that timescale into the telecom network. So the telecom network that interconnects all of these financial nodes can provide very accurate time as a service into any application that needs to use it. And it's known as the virtual primary reference time clock. So the PRTC acronym is the primary reference time clock. We have these very accurate systems where they have their own atomic clock. So this is an atomic clock that is assessed against the satellite timing signals. So we have very sophisticated algorithms looking at the satellite signals, working out if they're real or spoofed. While the real signal is there, while the valid signal is there, the atomic clocks are characterized so that if there is any interference, the atomic clocks will give you holdover and give you much better than 100 nanoseconds of error away from UTC over 14 days. So if we're trying to meet MIFID requirements, if we're trying to meet the most stringent 100 microseconds, we can easily do that with these systems. And this is just one example of that enhanced primary reference time clock. The virtual PRTC, the VPRTC, is this concept of with dedicated optical links, dedicated DWDM links between these sites, we can use these very high performance PTP boundary clocks to get time anywhere around this optical ring. And this could be tens of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers between these sites. We can get less than 5 nanoseconds error. So if all of these other sites, if there was some sort of nation, if the whole of Europe satellite timing signals were jammed or interfered with across the whole of Europe, in this scenario, this type of clock architecture would keep very high accuracy clocks available anywhere over this network, much better than those MIFID requirements, obviously. So it will easily meet those requirements for a long time if there is any outage. But it's a concept that's becoming more and more popular of bringing the clock within the network and using that, using GNSS to condition and assess the clock while it's present, but being aware that it might not always be there and falling back to your own local clock that can keep these critical infrastructure systems working in the event of any interference. So that brings us to the end of this talk. In summary, in the financial services sector, in enterprise and in financial trading, time synchronization is not just there because it's a technical necessity. In most systems there is some technical requirement that we need accurate timestamps, but it's also mandated by the regulator. in that in terms of European MiFID II regulations, we have to provide traceability and documentation of traceability to UTC. We have to maintain this ongoing assessment at least once a year to prove that our systems are compliant. Networks are evolving, and they're now giving us the opportunity to deliver secure, resilient, and traceable time to more points in the network using these architectures like the virtual primary reference time clock. And having this source of time available throughout the network enables much better performance monitoring and control. And in MiFID II, there is, of course, as I mentioned, this requirement for ongoing assessment, ongoing audits and reviews, and that's something that that Kronos is capable of doing. So as a value-added system integrator, we can not only supply and install the clock systems, we can also supply the expertise, the field engineers and the field technicians to go to site to audit timing systems that have already been installed, maybe by third parties, and to do the yearly auditing and reviewing of the performance specifically for MiFID II. So that's it. That brings us to the end of this particular webinar. Thank you very much for attending, and join us on the 8th of February for the second in this series, looking at various aspects of timing in financial services. Thank you.